The tic topic we are talking about today is tics. Are they different in boys and girls? You know, if you have a girl and you have a boy and they both had tics, are you going to address them differently? Yeah, you're going to address them differently, but not based on the fact that they are a boy or a girl. Okay? What I want to know is, don't you want to address your child's tics based on the unique individual child? Not on, okay, it's a boy or a girl. We know boys tend to be written off with all sorts of things much more often than girls. But for me, it's not about, I've got a boy and a girl and they both have tics. I have never taken a child that I've worked with and said, oh, you're a girl, we're going to do it this way. You're a boy, we're going to do it this way. No. We are looking at that unique individual part of each child. So we're looking at that unique approach. So for me, it's not about, hey, it's a boy or a girl, are they different? To me, it's about how do we look at that unique individuality of each person who's struggling with this? Because everybody has different triggers, different things that are going on in and around the body. Okay, so this study, this 2022 study that just came out, says that boys have more extreme symptoms than girls, but with the exception of emotional issues, girls tend to have more emotional issues with the tics than boys do. And you know what? When I look at my clients, because I've worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids with tics all around the world, I won't say that boys have more extreme issues because I have equal amount of girls who have extreme tics. But what I will tell you that I notice is that the girls do have a higher incidence of emotional issues than the boys. Time and time again, the girls that I'm working with have more of the suicidal kind of ideations. They don't want to be here. Definitely much more anxious. And so I will tell you that I don't see, in the hundreds of clients I worked with, and I've worked with tons of boys and girls, I don't see a huge difference in the extreme tic activity. They're usually, you've got some that are aggressive, you've got some that are mild, some are girls, some are boys. But what I really find is that the girls do have more emotional issues. And that's really what this study says. This study says that boys have more extreme symptoms than girls with the exception of emotional issues. I don't necessarily think that they have more extreme issues. I definitely think the girls have more emotional issues. I do see that. So this is a study that I agree with on some particular level. But for me, it's not about we're going to look at you and we're going to address your tics based on the fact that you're a boy or a girl, because I've never done that. I'm going to look at your tics and say, okay, what's going on under the hood? What's happening inside your body so that we can address it based on your unique individuality? So let's talk a little bit about boys and girls and the differences and some of the things that we see. So boys tend to develop until around age 25. So boys are really not fully mature until they're about 25 or 26 years old. Whereas girls now at this point are developing much sooner, and they are peaking 17 or 18 years old. So you have girls here and you have boys that are taking this, much longer to develop. So we are looking at the fact that, there's some interesting and scary and staggering statistics when it comes to boys and girls. And it's not just on tics, but with things that are happening in general. So in the past 40 years, we've seen about a 30% reduction in all men in testosterone. So men had much higher levels of testosterone in the 60s and the 70s than they do now. The levels of testosterone in our men and boys has dropped significantly in the last 40 years, by about 30%. And so we have to then ask ourselves, why is that? Because testosterone and estrogen are very anti-inflammatory. So we have to start to ask ourselves, why have we seen such a decrease in testosterone? What is happening to our men and boys? I have two sons, so this is, a very interesting topic. We're going to talk about girls in a second. But you have to start to look at things that are going on in the environment. So you have to start to look at herbicides, pesticides, parabens, chemicals. So we know that there's about 180,000 different chemicals on the market, and only about 5% of those have ever been tested for their impact on the body. So we know things like parabens are really impactful for our hormones like estrogen and testosterone. So we have to look at this. Testosterone is extremely important in the growth of our boys, but most parents think that, hormones start around 10 or 11. Boys really don't start getting testosterone, good testosterone, around 15, 16, maybe even a little bit older. You can actually look at blood work to see, as they become teenagers, what those testosterone levels are. But we have to look at, there are major differences in boys and girls, especially the fact that we have boys that are maturing at a slower rate. They're not, developing fully until 25 or 26. You have girls peaking 17, 18, but girls are going through puberty much sooner. And one of the significant things that we're seeing in both boys and girls is estrogen dominance. So estrogen is outweighing the testosterone in both boys and girls. So this is a lot of times where you're starting to see things like males with, getting breast tissue. You're seeing girls go through puberty much younger. And there's lots of things that, one of the major things we see blamed for that is cow's milk, is dairy milk, because we are constantly drinking and consuming dairy that comes from cows who are always high in estrogen. And then dairy farmers are like, well, we're not injecting them with estrogen. And I'm like, no, but they are lactating. So of course they are going to have higher hormones, which is going to come into the milk and the dairy products that we're eating. So that is one of the major things that, people have kind of attributed to, especially girls going through puberty earlier, is this estrogen dominance. But what's happening in our environment? Again, we have to look at what's going on in our environment. The herbicides, the pesticides, the parabens, the phthalates, the chemicals everywhere. But we also have to look at, what are those foods that we're putting into our body? How are they impacting us? How are they impacting our gut? How are they impacting our inflammation in our immune system? How are they impacting our neurotransmitters, which are made in our gut, most of them? So we have to look at, there are staggering differences in boys and girls. But what we have to understand, and a lot of parents, this is one of those misinformation things on the internet. This is where Dr. Google doesn't always get stuff so right. Lots of parents will say their kids' tics get worse as they go through puberty. Yes, because growing rapidly, doubling in height and weight and size is very inflammatory, right? But testosterone and estrogen are very anti-inflammatory. So that should actually calm the effect. The tics should get better as they go through puberty, not worse. So if they are getting worse as they go through puberty, there's other things that need to be looked at. What is going on inside the body? Why are we seeing this increase in tics during puberty? Inflammation. Why are we seeing all this inflammation, this uncontrolled, we're going to call it uncontrolled inflammation, because certain amounts of inflammation are good in the body. Why are we seeing all this uncontrolled inflammation? So growth in boys and girls requires a lot of energy, Your brain uses the majority of the energy that's produced in your body. It is quite the energy sucker. So you have to understand, girls and boys require a lot of energy to grow, but especially in the brain. And so one of the major things that I've seen, and I'm telling you, I'm going to gather the data because I've got it. I just have to gather it and do a study about autophagy. Because autophagy is your body's cell recycling center. Okay, this is like if you took the trash out to the curb and the garbage man never came, you would end up with trash everywhere. So in a week, 2 weeks, there would be garbage everywhere. This is what happens when we don't have good autophagy. And I can tell you from looking at the genetics of all of my hundreds of clients, from looking at genetics from all of the doctors and other providers that I have trained in genetics, kids with tics autophagy is an issue. Your cellular recycling, it is an issue. I can look at the genes for autophagy and say, hey, here's part of the problem. Autophagy is that cellular recycling. So think of it like a water balloon. You have a water balloon that gets really full and it's full of water and nothing else is getting in. So if your cells are full and they're inflamed and nothing else is getting in, it can't do the processes that it needs to do. So autophagy has something called mTOR, and it's like the speedometer for your cells. And when we're growing, that becomes overworked. That speedometer, your cells, they're being overworked. They're having to do all of these things to keep up. And so when we know this genetic weakness, regardless of boys and girls, we know that the brain cannot produce the necessary energy it needs. And so your brain is then lacking energy. We see a lot of symptoms. This is where we talk about the last couple episodes. So your brain then cannot produce a lot of energy. So we have to look at the fact that regardless of boys and girls, your kids require a lot of energy. And second, we have to look at what's happening on the genetic level. Where do these genetic weaknesses lie? Not just for you and your kids, but in general. So not everybody develops the same. Everybody is different. So this study, when we're looking at this study, we're looking at just simply sex of the child, boy versus girl. But we're really not looking at the fact that everyone develops differently. Your child may not grow as rapidly as my child. I have two teenagers. I have a 15-year-old who's almost 6 feet tall, and I have a 17-year-old who's 5'7". So you have to consider everybody's unique. They come from the same genetic pool, but they're definitely developing and growing differently. So we have to take this into account. How do you create energy? How well do your cells work? What do you need to support that? So you have to look at the unique underlying issues and weaknesses in each person, regardless of sex. So in a study that's limited to boys versus girls, it's really actually more important to look at the underlying issues. So what are those triggers? What are those things that are impacting you inside the body? What are those genetic weaknesses, and how do we build them up? Versus, we're going to just base this on sex, boys versus girls. So if you're really struggling, one of the most important things you can do is look at their genetics. We can talk about not looking at random genetics like 23andMe because it's a novelty test. It's not going to give you the information you need. You don't have someone to analyze it. So when you're really, really struggling, genetics is actually a very important piece of this puzzle. Boys versus girls, we actually are looking at genetics based on boy versus girl, based on sex. We're going to know because some things are X-linked, which means you could only get it from mom. So it's going to be different in boys versus girls. And this is another reason I tell parents all the time, you can't base one kid's genes off of another, because you might have a girl and you might have a boy. And the genes are going to be different because you have things that are linked to mom that only your son is going to have one and your daughter is going to have two. So it's going to be really different when we start to look at the genes. So the other things that we have to look at, doesn't matter if you're boy or girl, is that GABA glutamate balance. We have to look at inflammatory markers. We have to look at what's going on under the hood. So although, I do see that girls have more emotional issues than boys, when we start to look at the genetics, we can actually get those girls back on track really quick because we're able to apply what I call genetic nutrition. So I find these studies and this question from parents, this is a question I get all the time, really curious and really interesting, because for me, it's not about, boy versus girl. How are we going to address it? I'm going to look at the unique individuality of each child. And I think it's going to be the same. You go to the neurologist. Is your neurologist going to look at your child differently than if they're a boy or a girl? They're not. They're not going to look at it differently. So I do think this is really interesting, but we have to take into account all of these things that are impacting our children on a unique individual level. Some kids may have a harder time with environmental toxins because maybe they don't detoxify very well. We can look at those genetics. We can look at those environmental toxins that they've been exposed to through urine test. We need to look at the unique individuality of each child and really look at how we can start to improve them on a genetic level, on an internal level. So was that helpful? Did you guys find that info helpful today? Helpful. It was a little bit shorter. So the study says, yes. Study says boys have more severe tics, but girls have more emotional issues with those tics. It tends to say that boys typically have more symptoms like ADHD and OCD. I think when you look at it from a clinical perspective, I don't see that. I think girls are just as equal. This study is missing the fact that it's not boys versus girls. This study is missing the fact that it's about unique individuality. So what does this mean for your family? This for your family means that you need to know what's going on in your unique individual child. You need to know what's going on under the hood. You need to know what's going on in your child, or even you, if it's you that's experiencing this. And I know that we spend a lot of time focusing on children because that is my specialty, but we do work with some adults. So I do think that's interesting.